Welcome to week 11, topic 10, and we're talking about engagement strategies, engaging the learner. And of course, we're not offering them here a Michael Hill ring. We are in fact offering them some strategies to lay down some pretty solid schema in their learning and to connect it to their worlds. And this essentially is the foundation of the Australian curriculum in science. So let's have a look at how we're going to go about doing this. I mean, this week I'm going to introduce you to 3 new acronyms. They're probably not so new: STEAM, STEM, and STEAM. And of course, STEM being the science, technology, engineering, mathematics. The A is the arts when it becomes STEAM, and the empowerment is the E when it becomes STEAM. And we're going to have a look at this, this agenda. Currently it's a political agenda, it's also an economic agenda, and it's also a creative and innovative agenda. And it's set against a backdrop where we're seeing, more and more students disengage with science at the primary and at the secondary level. We've got our least science participation uptake of all time in universities at the moment, and the least number of people in IT courses as well. So we're starting to see a real brain drain here away from the sciences. And of course, in response to this, the Palaszczuk government have actually established the notion of a STEM champion, and trying to, funding it to $81 million statewide to put STEM champions in school districts and in schools at least once a day. There's another $142 million in the pipeline to fund teacher training, new IT assist people, and of course classroom assistants for the STEM curricula too. And Barack Obama in the United States back in 2014 actually created what he called his STEM Corps. So in America, it's like an army of teachers running around, re-engineering the curriculum with technology, engineering, science and maths types integrated focus. So it's a very powerful agenda, and the message to teachers is, if you're not on board, think about how you're going to get there, because clearly jobs of the future are going to be aligned to these particular curriculum and pedagogical skills and areas. So when we're looking at it, we're looking this week at engagement, and how do you make lessons engaging? Well, it's not rocket science. And here we're using the human endeavour strand. And if you could meet and do lunch with one scientist from history, who would it be and why? And think about it, not many of us use the human endeavour strand. We're all about science understandings. But if you think about human endeavour, it's a rich heuristic. It can link together a whole range of areas of the curriculum: the environment, ethics, aesthetics, sustainability, one of the ACS priorities. And if we look at it, we can see all 4 of these people have had a huge impact on human endeavour. We've got Albert Einstein, we've got Madame Curie, we've got a person with dark skin there that's quite unusual. And then we've got, of course, Noam Chomsky on the end, famous linguist and lyricist. And as you can see here, is it even slightly engaging to throw this in front of kids? They then have to work out who these people are, when they lived, what they did, why they're important, and ultimately what impact their science has had on each of these child's lives. So it's really a very engaging task for students. You may not choose the same 4 scientists, but it's a very engaging approach. And of course, when we look at that dark, mysterious person, it's David Unaipon. And of course, one of our first Aboriginal writers and public speakers. And as we can see, he's a Ngarrindjeri man, and he invented a sheep shearing tool. He was always experimenting with inventions, but in his later life became more of a writer and public speaker and advocate for Aboriginal rights. He came from a very humble beginning, very humble background. Wrote his famous treatise, Native Legends, in 1929, and of course laid the foundations for a lot of activism for Aboriginal people to follow. So a real scientist, a real innovator, a real leader in the field. And of course, introducing a scientist like David Unaipon, actually it also tackles one of the other Australian curriculum science priority areas of Indigenous culture and practices. So there are ways we can incorporate a whole range of human endeavour strategies into our teaching and use them as an organisation device for what we deliver to our students and the units we teach. Introduction this week, we're talking about engagement not simply being focused in class. And engagement is affected by emotional, behavioural and external factors. These are all things that we can take as given. Engagement is also affected by emotional, behavioural and external factors, and we're going to talk a little bit about that as well. The topic obviously is going to tackle the 5 E's because we're doing our assessment task number 2, and we're using the 5 E's approach basically as the focus or the structuring device for that assessment task. And we're going to begin from the engage, the first E in the 5 E's paradigm, or the E5 paradigm, which basically looks at how we get students on board and how we engage not only their interest and their motivation, which is one of the questions I've had in email this week, but we also engage their understandings. You know, we work out where they're at, we get to a baseline measure of where they're at, and then we motivate them to engage with our subject material. So motivation and engagement are slightly different, okay, for purposes of assessment task 2. So make sure you're highlighting or at least addressing that difference in your work. By the end of the topic, define engagement, list factors that affect engagement, identify barriers, describe models, and of course he will talk about STEM, STEAM and STEAM, and explain ways of preparing lessons for engagement. So a bit of territory to get through. Key terms: engagement, when students are deeply involved with their learning. More importantly, and when that learning impacts on the lives of the students. The 5 E's model is a 5-stage teaching model. POE is another common inquiry model. It's an 8-phase model. Problem-based learning is a 4-phase model. But each focuses on students' learning and how they become engaged in activity that links to their prior knowledge, with exploring and then elaborating on the new knowledge about a concept. Motivation is also there. It's the drive and willingness to expend energy to learn and achieve. Okay, so engage is the initial contact, the initial baseline interaction. Motivation is about sustaining that baseline interaction over the duration of a unit of study, once we've engaged them. That's a critical difference, so make sure you're referring to that again and drawing on that difference in assessment task number 2. Gregson does engagement quite well. If you've done your reading for the week, and I encourage you to, little figure 5.2 demonstrates that quite well. We have engagement sitting at in the middle of his little concept map. It's got behavioural components, you know, behavioural involvement in academic, participation in social and extracurricular activities. It's got emotional, positive and negative connotations with the classroom, with schools, with teachers and peers, and there's a feeling of belonging and also a sense of students owning their learning. And of course it's also got its cognitive components. You know, there's thoughtfulness and willingness to comprehend complex ideas and master difficult skills. Now you will see all of this written throughout the units of study that you're currently analysing. We can see, however, when we talk about cognition, that it's not really all about what the teacher does. Here we've got a wonderful little misconception at the top of the page there, and we can see that we have our own impact on that. Now when we read that, we read it as the cat, but when we look at it, it's not that at all. And here we've got our brain. Our brain is doing some compensatory thinking here. It's filling in a lot of the gaps. And what we've got to do as teachers is actually enter that zone. And we've got to pause things at that particular point in time and make sure that we are breaking that down and we are addressing misconceptions as they happen. We're looking at where these understandings come from, how they get planted, and why they get planted there. And believe it or not, a lot of them come from internal perception. So the 5 E's model is our framework, or the E5 as I prefer to call it. It goes back further than Bribey. It goes back to the United States and was known under a different framework there. But we know it here as the 5 E's model because it's associated with the Australian curriculum and it's heavily quoted as that. But the principles here for designing and planning using the 5 E's, I can intentionally build upon relationships in my classroom with and among my students through carefully planned activities. Now that's assessment task number 2, intentional creation and extension of student frameworks. I can design instruction that promotes an engaged and active learning environment, and I can sustain that through motivation. And then I can explain how assessment can be active and engaging. Assessment task number 2, and where it could be more engaging and more active, I'm going to make some recommendations. Alright, moving on. Think back. Think back to a teacher, to a time when a teacher who influenced you and influenced your life became quite significant to you, and who that person was and what they stood for and how it was they connected with you. And it could be some of the simple things they did, you know, like inviting each student to colour the room with science. A photograph, a poster, a piece of artwork, a newspaper clipping, a magazine cover. Little simple things that make a difference. Quote of the day. A teacher posts it as a first 2 or 3 weeks, and then the students are allocated and they choose and start to contribute. Create a science graffiti board. I mean, what we're doing here is we're creating science real estate where we're giving students place and opportunity to take control of the learning and to define that learning. Okay, they can leave messages on the science graffiti board for they're working on projects. Of course, they've got to be appropriate for public viewing. Okay, and you have to discipline the students into using a graffiti board. But there you have it. We've got science in our face. And a school locally here in Townsville that does this extremely well is Heatley State School. Around the 4 walls of the classroom and even on the ceiling, you can look up and you can see student curriculum and curriculum responses. You can see their ownership plastered on the walls and ceilings of their classroom. It's a really rich heuristic. A simple method of getting the students to own the room and to own their science is laminate whiteboard paper and use dry erase markers. Just get them to write up their ideas, little science messages and creations to each other. Gregson talks about small E and big E engagement. The big E, okay, is the big picture stuff. School is, for me, education is a resource now and in the future. And here we see, for instance, you know, there's a lot of different social and cultural capital amongst our students. And the big E engagement, you know, a lot of rich and well-resourced schools, a lot of averagely and poorly resourced schools. And we start to see the cultural capital within each of those education frameworks as varying incredibly. You know, my own brother's children, I remember 15, 16 years ago when they were finishing primary school and graduating, I went to their primary school to actually be part of their, my nephew's, Sean, his graduation in primary school, and walked up to a school and on the front notice board of the school was Meadow Vale Primary School, sponsored by the Ford Motor Company of Australia. So it gives you an idea, for instance, that, you know, schools are out there competing for resources. And a lot of schools are struggling to get the resources they need and therefore struggling to build the cultural capital. Now, in those poorer schools, the big E engagement, you know, lacks. There's not a lot of social vision, there's not a lot of trust in education, and there's, you know, not a lot of valuing of education at the same level. It's not supported in the same way at home. The small E's of engagement, where we start to look at what happens in classrooms. Students get involved in active participation. We're focusing on learning behaviours. We're talking about emotions, you know, the genuine valuing of peers and of learning. We're talking about reflective understanding and deep conversations and expertise. That is, critical conversations, deep conversations about learning. And what I'll do at this stage is introduce you to Dr. Christine Redmond. Now, Christine Redmond is a consultant educationalist who works from Brisbane, and she's brought to you by the Queensland College of Teachers here and doing a little video on behaviour management module. And here she's looking at some of those small E engagement strategies.
Can people here give me some examples of acknowledging? How do you acknowledge students?
Christine, with my multi-age, I go around. Proximity is very important to the children. So you go around and you reinforce verbally, very positively to children as you're going along. That gives you the opportunity also to correct, but in the background say, sweetheart, you're not on task there, I need you to be on task. So acknowledging they're using their name and acknowledging the appropriate behaviour, what you expect them to do and how you can observe that. So they like that personal.
Brilliant.
Well, I have a behaviour chart, or I have two systems actually. I've got a behaviour chart for negative sort of behaviour, and they've got steps that go as well with that. But to really help them, I use a sticker chart or a stamp chart now, and it's two sort of ways you can get stamps. It's, you know, either good behaviour or doing good work, you know, producing good work. Therefore, you can get both of those.
Thank you.
I had an interesting experience with a kid who wasn't working, and I hadn't been able to get into work all year, and lots of phone calls home to parents, lots of bad reports, lots of overcorrection, I suppose, until finally he actually did some work in class, and I rang up his folks and said, oh, he's done something good, and he's just been an angel ever since, and is quite liking that the fact that I added acknowledgement. And I started to like him a lot more.
So one thing that I have readily done over the years in terms of trying to preserve teachers' that whole notion of self-efficacy is to really remind people of the achievements in front of them and really remind staff of that they are surrounded by students who are capable and who are intelligent and who can achieve. And if you're in the classroom and you're drawn into that period 4, end of the day, caffeine's run out, you're looking for those milestones. So part of it is the ability of staff to articulate what their students are capable of. And I'll give a practical example. I've asked staff for a long, long time, don't just send me the students that have done the wrong thing, send me the students that have done the right thing. And the students that come to my office because they've done, it may have just been that they've constructed a paragraph in a certain way. They may have achieved an A+, but it might be some students who've just fulfilled some potential that the teacher's always known has been there, and they feel good about themselves. And whether it's a sticker or a smiling note or something, that goes back to the teacher. And next time something might go wrong with that student, they know that potential is there. So I guess in summary, it's a way of allowing staff to know that their students are capable and that they can achieve and that their job is worthwhile. And if they can articulate that and that's a constant reminder in front of them, you're less likely to lose that whole self-efficacy.
Yeah.
I think the word.
Holding it up as a collective.
Holding it up as a collective, and that's what we call the small and probably the biggie engagement, moving from an individual teacher approach or classroom approach through to a whole school approach. And last week, we talked about BIGS and constructive alignment and how this would happen first of all between teaching and learning, between teaching and learning behaviours, and then between learning outcomes and assessment, and then hopefully and ultimately right across an entire school. So a whole school is engaged and aligned as a learning organisation. So the small E and the big E come together. Gregson doesn't actually use Biggs's work in the Solo taxonomy, but does talk about the small E and the big E, and he's talking about the very same things that Biggs was talking about last week. Martin Haberman, a famous educationalist, and if you ever get a chance to read some of his work, do. He talks about students being engaged, and when students are involved in issues they regard as vital concerns, they're being helped to see major concepts, big ideas and general principles, and they're not simply looking at isolated facts or learning isolated facts or using isolated facts to drive their understandings. They're involved in planning what they are doing. That's an interesting one, planning what they're doing. And they're involved in applying ideals such as fairness, equity and justice to their world. Think about that. Haberman based his research on extensive studies and came up with these 4 final findings. What would an engaged student, what environment would they actually buy into? And here's a fairly concise statement of that. Student engagement defined. When we look at an engaged student, is attentive, persistent, connected and committed. And Philip Schlechter's done a lot of work in this in the States, and he came out with this, but not all students who are involved are engaged, and he goes on to create a hierarchy of engagement. And of course, every time we make a point, we then break it down and sort of say, well, here's how we use data, here's how we explain our model, and here's what our model says about learners. And Schlechter has quite a few things to say here when we look at his work. He identifies 5 student responses to work and to motivation. And he says, the best response we can have, the highest level response that we want and could hope for, is that response of engagement. And Schlechter talks about engagement as being high attention and high commitment to tasks, to learning tasks. His second phase, as you can see, is a watering down of that strategic compliance. The student or the learner has still got high attention, but they've kind of got low commitment. Now, this is, in the literature, this is often associated with female students and young female students in the learning environment, and the strategies in the past, and 15 years ago and further back. If we do some backward chaining through this data, we can see that teachers used to reward students for their compliance. And of course, this has given rise to good students being considered to be strategically compliant. We have ritual compliance, low attention and low commitment to the tasks at hand. So notice, for instance, they're there because really they don't have anything else to be or anywhere else to go or anything else to do. So school for them is a safe spot which doesn't challenge them, doesn't extend them, doesn't help them grow. We've got retreatism, students with no attention and no commitment, but basically they're not harmful. They're retreating into the smiley world of lunchtimes and playtimes and sports fields. And then we have the nastier versions of those, or the more feral versions, that rebellion, what Schlechte calls rebellion, where students have diverted attention. And, we can look at some other famous educational theorists like Etienne Wenger, who talks here about identity of participation. That is, students who are engaged and strategically compliant or ritually compliant all have an identity of participation, because you can see that they're 1, 2 and 3, they're actually participating. But when we get down to 4 and 5, we're starting to see identities of non-participation, as Wenger would say. And believe it or not, Wenger would challenge us as teachers by saying, don't just focus on the kids up here in 1, 2 and 3 who you think are working hard on identities of participation, because these kids in 4 and 5, particularly in 5, are working super hard on their identities of non-participation. And here is our motivational challenge. Okay? And classroom management starts to come into its own play here. So think about the research there I'm referring to is Etienne Wenger, published in 1995 was his first seminal piece, but now works mostly in large corporations and with large organisations, and did his PhD thesis, believe it or not, on American postal workers, and was therefore fully understands what participation behaviours are like and what non-participation behaviours are like. So a really good read if you ever get the time. But we'll look at Schlechte's work now and what it means for us in a classroom. So an engaged student is going to go through each of these 6 steps, and we're going to be able to identify it in them. And we can see that there's a fair degree of bloom woven into Schlechte's work here. We can see that they're going to remember, and this is the comprehend category down here. They're going to understand, they're going to apply, analyse, evaluate and create. So we don't have a huge problem with our engaged student. As a matter of fact, we love them. Okay, but let's face it, less than 40% of our science class are this group. Strategically compliant, they're still creating, they're evaluating, they're analysing, applying, understanding, and they can recall and remember. Okay? But mostly, we're starting to look at more recall than remember. So it's not going in as deep, it's not sticking, and it's not connecting. We're not really seeing as bigger shifts in learner frameworks, as much deep learning and deep conversation. Then we've got our ritually compliant. We can see they're still creating. We've got identities of participation running across these 3 groups. They're still evaluating. They're still doing their analysis. They're still applying this in certain situations. They're still understanding, but it's leaving their heads a lot quicker because their level of engagement is not as high. Now we start to get to our identities of non-participation, our retreatists and our rebels. Our retreatists learn little, same with our rebels. They have negative attitudes, same as our rebels. And retreatists generally disengage and then slides into a scale of disruption. A rebel straight away goes out disrupting. And unfortunately, down here at this end of the scale is where a teacher spends most of their time. Now, we don't have time in this course to look at behaviour management, but it is a major issue. And behaviour management essentially is a contract between yourself about how much ground you're prepared to give in order to acknowledge students and keep them focused on a middle road program. And sometimes that middle road is really up here at the engaged stage. And depending on your class, sometimes it can be the best you can hope for from most of the class is ritual compliance. And sometimes the best you can hope for is for them not to rip the roof off the building. So maybe in another course at another time we'll get a chance to talk about that. But by and large, Schlechte has a lot to say here about engagement and about learners. And we can see here that different levels of engagement are going to lead to different learning outcomes. This reflects some of the work Biggs was talking about too. Engaged students are creative students. Okay? And as we slide down that scale of engagement, we're starting to see those learning outcomes slip further and further away from our students. Back to Gregson. Factors affecting engagement. And they're student factors, teacher, whole school, parent factors and community. And when we look at it, we've got the students' own perceptions. I mean, we get a lot of students going into classrooms and starting from a very low baseline. We've got students with a strong desire to learn and focus on learning goals. we've got students developing good study and time management skills. And we've got students who are persistent, enthusiastic, interested, enjoy. They've got full of pride and satisfaction in doing a good job. And we also have a range, as Slechty points out, a range of at least 5 dimensions where we could differentiate between our students in one particular classroom. Teachers also, the classroom climate. Think back to your own time about a teacher you loved. What was it so significant about that teacher? What was the classroom climate? The whole school. And here we've got Biggs. We can go back to Biggs and we can look at, as I say over here on the right-hand side, his concept of constructive alignment. We can begin with the student, with the learner. Then the teacher adds their repertoire of skills. The whole school must put its stamp on it. The school community must be influential enough to establish a culture of learning through parent bodies. And of course, this can extend out into the community, into the perception of the school and its relationships with communities. So we can see here, Gregson talks well about this. No need for me to repeat it. But there are several factors affecting engagement and therefore affecting motivation. So if you can, be aware of these. Moving into the acronyms, and we had to get there eventually. Now, education's full of acronyms, as you know. On the right-hand side, I just threw in the AC for the Australian curriculum. Now, we've got a STEAM, which is empowerment, science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics. Now, STEAM is the final evolution or iteration of the STEM agenda. STEM began with mathematics, science, technology and engineering, and an approach. And we can see it here. And I've differentiated STEAM, but STEM began this way too, where science, technology, engineering, mathematics were basically taught in silos. And it was hoped through some process of osmosis that the disciplinary knowledge would overlap and would just like a fog, everything would blend together so that we came out with a STEM awareness. We then started to integrate STEM. And so the principles of science, the analysis of mathematics combined with design process of arts, technology and engineering, we get STEAM. But we saw that science, technology, engineering and maths were combined in some integrated strategies. And a course guiding principle there, Piaget's 1962 notion of the scientist in their own world. Now, STEAM adds both empowerment and the arts. And just to show the difference here, I've included the definition from Cyprus, Kohler and Hallinan. STEM education is an interdisciplinary approach to learning where rigorous academic concepts are coupled with real-world lessons as students apply science, technology, engineering and mathematics in contexts that make connections between school, community work and the global enterprise. Notice the business focus there. Enabling the development of STEM literacy and with it the ability to compete in a new economy. So here we have it. Since 2009, governments and education bodies all around the world have put a tremendous investment on the role of STEM to actually populate future jobs, future economies and future innovations. A little bit of rebellion, because a lot of teachers don't get STEM, and I'll talk about why in a minute. STEM is considered, these 4 curriculum areas, science, technology, engineering, mathematics, they're hard scientists. A lot of teachers, primary teachers in particular, think they're cold. Think about it yourself. How do you feel about those areas? Some of you may say, I surprise myself, I'm good at those areas, I'm actually surprised myself. Some people say, I love it. But you'll find yourself in a minority. Most primary school teachers, and the research points this out, are much more comfortable with the softer sciences than the harder scientists. And so we're starting to see a rebirth of STEAM. And with STEAM, we're starting to see this focus on STEAM, where we're seeing an integrated curriculum framework bringing about rich, artistic, innovative, as well as technological science and mathematical literacies within our students. Let's have a look at an example of this. The human endeavour strand. When we look at sciences, embedded in the human endeavour strand largely are the qualities of the arts and the arts overriding or overarching curriculum goals. We can see in the arts we've got creativity, aesthetics, ethics and rhetoric. Now it's a strange one, isn't it? But when we look at it, creativity, we want our students to be innovative, ingenious, imaginative, very much part of the visual performance and physical arts. Aesthetics, we talk about beauty, sentiment, contemplation, all of these things in literature, in poetry, in music. Ethics, we talk about virtues, human rights, justice, again embedded in our own human endeavour strand in sciences. And rhetoric, representation, expression, persuasion. Here we're looking about, students becoming active participants in the discourse of their own society through the ancient practices of rhetoric, which goes right back to the Greeks. So this notion of STEM, when we look at it up here, this is a diagram loaded down from steammedia.com, and we can see here that it's a lifelong holistic journey in STEM. And we add the A to it, the arts. We're bringing in a liberal arts focus. So we're bringing in the humanities, including physiology, music, anthropology, philosophy, in particular philosophy. And here we're looking for, once upon a time we taught all of these aspects in little silos. They all stood in the curriculum aside from each other. Now we're starting to see the integration. We're starting to move these together. They went through a phase where it became STEM and then the arts on the outside. And now we're looking very much at an environment, particularly in the United States, of a STEAM integrated, lifelong holistic journey. And here we've got our definitions running down the side of the pyramid. Content specific, okay, we all know that. That happens. Discipline specific. It does happen. It's a way of organising and creating, a little bit like the Dewey Decimal System in the library. We can't help it, it's there. We then became multidisciplinary, or tried to. That wasn't very well understood STEM. Even Dennis Goodrum went down on record this year, the guy who wrote the ACS, the Australian Curriculum in Science, as saying STEM is a fad. It will fade. And his prediction, it will turn into STEAM. My prediction, it will turn into STEAM. And STEAM is that lifelong holistic framework where students are empowered to use these curriculum areas to focus and develop in their own life, their own careers, and their own economies. I'm going to talk about robotics. And robotics is something people think, oh, God, that's so away from me, that's so foreign. Think twice, think about that again. I mean, on the right-hand side here, you can see down in the bottom corner that we've got the Townsville Challenge happening down here at CQ in 2000 on Remembrance Day in November. And this year the challenge is on hydrodynamics. And what essentially kids do, and here it is, look at how it's coined. This is happening in 20 schools around Townsville at the moment. It's happening, there are 622 teams Australia-wide. There are 7 competitions in Queensland alone, and there are 47 competitions Australia-wide in November dealing with this particular challenge. And what it is, it's an integration of robotics, science, technology, engineering, arts, mathematics, and it puts students in a game-based situation, and we'll have a look at it in a moment, where they get to determine the outcomes in a research project for their local community, and also through the cognitive artefacts, the physical artefacts, and cultural artefacts of robotics. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. But this all goes back to Castells, 1996, this whole STEM movement. And he talked about the information technology revolution. And he made a lot of arguments in his seminal piece, which he coined this term, the information technology revolution. And of course, from that, of course, came the digital divide. And the digital divide, like the closing the gap debate, it occurred between genders, it occurred between communities, it occurred between cultures. It occurred between people in coloured skins. We had Nicholas Negroponte and people like Nicholas Negroponte building holes in the wall computers in India, where people who did not even have literacy could come along and basically touch a keyboard through a hole in the wall and learn how to engage technology. And of course, Negroponte's projects became world famous. He also came up with the $20 laptop too, so he's the guy behind that project. But Castells talked about how the information technology revolution is not only going to change who we are and how we do things, but it's also going to change our minds. It's going to shape our brains. And he talked about how it's going to impact our existing conceptions and experiences of things as vague as time, space, relatedness, and what it is to know things, and on knowledge as well. And a little example just to illustrate what I mean here. Think of shopping. Now, as much as I hate shopping, I sometimes can't escape it. And sometimes I go out and do it on my own, just to win some brownie points as the male in the family. But I go out and I do it. And I'm armed with my shopping list, and I go to the least offensive supermarket I can possibly find, and I commence what I have christened to be the waltz of the walking dead, where you stroll the aisles, and it's a bit like being part of the zombie apocalypse. In order to make sure I have everything I need, I use my mobile phone, and I send a digital photo of my shopping list to my partner via her mobile phone, just to make sure I'm not missing anything out. She'll open up my photo, she'll audit my list, my itemised list, and then send back a brief SMS message a few seconds later with another 13 items added. In doing that, just to introduce, and talk about Castell's point here, she's played with time, space, our relatedness, the task, shopping. She's played with my head. We've both mediated new understandings of what our shopping needs really are. So we can start to see how information technology is such a profound thing, even in daily life. So imagine what it's going to be like in this new STEAM world, the new STEAM classroom, because it's coming. Okay, and it's going to differentiate between schools, teachers and learners in terms of social opportunity and in terms of cultural capital. So what this calls for is a reculturing of our innate ability to share experience through language, ritual, play and artefact. We saw that, the artefact of the mobile phone, the digital list, the language, the expansion, the ritual of interaction, and of course the little chuckle afterwards, when I got home saying, "Did you get my list?" Of course, there are winners and losers in technology. That day doing the shopping, of course, I was the loser. But classrooms, says Lancashire, can often be shackled by book space mentalities. And that means that, okay, if you're a teacher and you're not aware of this revolution that's taking place and the pace with which it's happening, chances are that you're going to be stuck in that book space mentality. You're going to be on the wrong side of history. So there's a very strong imperative for you to move along as a teacher and engage with these STEM skills. Of course, we're talking about $81 million investment from the government, with another $140 million rolling out this year. So it is a huge priority. But STEM is not something teachers love, and this is also creating a problem for teachers. It's kind of a potpourri of artificial intelligence, computer programming, electronic engineering, mechatronics and the robotics, which I do enjoy, but didn't always enjoy. There are new literacies involved, and there are techno-scientific epistemologies, that is, knowledges that many teachers really don't want to look at, particularly given that a large percentage of our teaching population has white or grey hair. They're really focusing much more on their superannuation than they are on these new learning agendas. So most teachers don't really relate to the hard scientists. And yet, with STEM is a hard, it's perceived to be a hard set of sciences, a science set. And with them they bring new learner agencies, new identity practices, new iconic worlds and new attention economies. Now, try teaching kids, the nerds. Try teaching them in traditional formats, in book space, with book space mentalities, and you are going to struggle. Because as Goldhaber says, they have a different attention economy. They have a new sense of agency about themselves. They have new practices. And they've got new iconic worlds which they relate to extremely well. So STEAM, says Lyotard, is where imagination carries the day. Now STEAM is not new. Look at the date of Lyotard's publication, 1984. Seminal year too, if you're George Orwell. James Paul Gee talks in 1986, his assertion that projects that make the worlds in the image of visions are what schools need. This is his assertion. Now, Gee is a famous researcher and famous educationalist who looked at the computer-mediated world and how it's changing education. And he was doing this 20 years ago. And can we point to a school-based project where students are making worlds in the images of visions that they have, where, the new economy we're talking about with STEM, are students actually creating that new economy? Are they doing classroom tasks built around that innovation? Are we using these new technologies and driving these ideas forward? Does such a project exist? What would such a vision entail? Teachers generally don't know. In a world preoccupied with environmental issues and global warming, what would an imagination of this kind look like? And I think in science, we're a little bit closer to most than knowing what it would look like. We have a human endeavour strand. We know about the accidental implications and outcomes of science. But imagine a robotics project built on what we consider to be the softer sciences. one that had art, that prioritised cooperative learning and teamwork skills, creativity and design, trial and error, leadership and organisational skills, presentation and problem-solving skills, technical skills and creative visualisation, and then sprinkle this with authentic problem sets and add the vital ingredient of robotic gameplay or gameplay generally. And that's where we come to with our robotics challenge this year. We basically ask students all around Australia up to age 16, what and how do our water choices impact our lives? We give them a research project, and we give them a game board, and we give them an imaginary world in which they can explore 10 challenges using a robot to look at future solutions to water choice issues and water future problems. Here's what that world looks like. This is the board. And just creating here, it actually looks like a computer game, doesn't it? But what happens is a robot leaves the home base here and skittles around the floor, and it completes a whole series of challenges. It's got 2.5 minutes, and there are 10 challenges on the challenge mat. All of these little pieces are built out of Lego, and the robot is an EV3 robot, so it's reasonably small. But the child has to program this robot to move around these tiny spaces. And you can see it's got light and dark spaces, so it uses light sensors. You can see that it's got boundaries and borders, so it uses its gyro sensors. It uses to read angles. It uses its ultrasonic sensors to read borders and barriers. So these students are creating this little cognitive artifact. They are scientists in this imaginary world where they are using an artifact to explore dynamic and problematic solutions to deep social problems. So the learner manipulates this cognitive artifact to their own design. And in doing so, there's no room for solitary discovery here because they share their intelligences. And they're adding to distributed knowledge, to artifactual systems, and to social and science understandings. Now, kids have gone on from this program to create and manufacture a whole range of science applications worldwide. And Salomon's comments, brilliant, again from 1993. See, this is not new. First Lego League, the one I'm showing you here, is something I introduced in Australia here in 2004. But it had been going for 10 years before I introduced it here in Australia and in the United States. And the child is scaffolded in the achievement of activity in explicitly constraints of the artifacts. Achievement of activity, okay, poor quote here, I obviously made a mistake. The child is scaffolded in the achievement of activity and explicitly within the constraints of the artifacts which the child is playing. So the learner is pushing boundaries. The learner is taking and creating new artifacts. The learner is innovating new solutions and resolutions at all times. So we say, all right, all well and good. That's okay for some teachers, but what about the Australian curriculum? And here's just a little example of how far robotics has come in this 10-year period, 10-12-year period. We can see here that it's integrated into all the generic capabilities of the Australian curriculum. It achieves and ticks boxes for all of those capabilities, particularly, as you can imagine, the ICTs. And this is only some of the curriculum areas that have been, that I've included here. All of them have been mapped. There's only some. We've got design and technology. We've got digital technologies. English. Believe it or not, there are 2 pages of English descriptors and elaborations that the robotics addresses. We've got health and physical education. We've got science. And this is just the science inquiry skills. This doesn't touch on the science understandings. We've got human and social sciences. And the list goes on and on and on. We can see that, robotics is no longer just about that narrow world of the hard sciences. It now has full integration right across the Australian curriculum up to years 9 and 10. It's now embedded fully in curriculum and compulsory curriculum years. So it's no longer something new. These technologies, this STEM, this STEAM, this STEAM, is no longer a new phenomenon. It's pretty much here to stay. And it's a skill that teachers are going to require, if not through professional development, through involvement as a pre-service teacher or as a teacher in your own school in community-based programs and initiatives. We can go on to talk about engagement strategies at the engage stage, the first stage of the 5 E's. And there's a range of things that we can do there too, because let's face it, in assessment task number 2, we begin from that engaged stage, and then it's the challenge is to maintain the motivation, to sustain the engagement through motivation through the remaining 4 phases of the 5 E's. So what can we do? We help students make a personal collection as our first connection, as our first port of call. We can present a slideshow. We can invite guest speakers into our classrooms. But notice every time we do something, we get the students to do something. Get students to create their own PowerPoint slideshow. Have students hear from members of the professional community. Use a variety of media. Display a statement on the board. Surprise the students with theatre. Notice that what we're doing here is for every move we make, we are expecting the student to make a move in return. This is not passive learning. This is how we cover our baseline assessment. Is the interest and curiosity of the students being captured? How do we know? Is the context relevant to the students? How do we know if we're not asking these questions? If we're not doing this baseline and diagnostic assessment? Has information about the students' present understanding been obtained? The first stage, the engaged stage. What can we do? We can do a lot. There are 6 points. We can engage students with graphic organisers also. And these graphic organisers are broken down into a range of different designs. We've got concept maps, which most of us are quite familiar with. Time sequence maps is mapping an activity or an event or a growing knowledge base over time. Description maps. Cause and effect maps. Usually done as a set of axes. If we increase this, what happens to this? What happens to our line or curve or to our level of outcome or production? Okay, we can look at a whole range of different graphic organisers. Some of them digital, but we can look at a whole range of them to explore and develop and engage learner frameworks. And some of those we looked at last week, for instance, with the online interaction with the camera. Okay, what happens if the camera moves forward and back in terms of the photo that's actually being taken? Focus from last week. We need to look at engagement, and when we talk about engagement, we're talking about engaging the brain. Now, the brain does not function simply as an audio or visual tape recorder. For too long, we've assumed that it does. Okay, it doesn't. We know that there are actual stages of learning. And in a little diagram down here on the left-hand side, we can see our stages of learning. The first is acquisition, where learners collect from the environment, the stimulus. They collect their knowledge. Once they collect it, it gets embedded in the neurological system, for want of a better word, and also the emotional system and the limbic brain. But we've got the process then of processing it. And we do this through rehearsal. So when we pick up some learning, we rehearse it. For instance, think about a catchy tune you hear. Okay, you catch it in the background. You weren't really listening to it, but all of a sudden you find yourself humming it. So there's the rehearsal. It's gone into your short-term memory and you're processing it. Okay, you start then to keep it because you get an emotional attachment to that song, to that tune. And ultimately, later in the day, you're feeling a bit tired and sad, and what do? All of a sudden you find yourself humming it again. So you're retrieving it. So here we are, this little song, this little tune, it's gone through its 4 stages of acquisition, rehearsal, retention and retrieval. So you have completed the learning, and it's relevant to you because it's connected to your behaviour and to your position. The next thing we have to do is commit it to memory. Okay, and that's the challenge. Here's where the curriculum and the pedagogy comes in, the 5 E's, if you like. So in the engage stage, we're doing a lot of stimulus, okay, an awareness of a stimulus. We're creating that. We're testing it out. What do you know about it? What is it? What do you think it means? Okay, then we're starting to do some immediate applications to it. So we're starting to acquire some knowledge of what that knowledge is, or what that interaction is, or what that event was. It then gets put into our working memory, where we then start to do a science investigation, where we take it, we make a prediction about it, we try to establish here in the immediate phase a rule that describes it. We take that rule and we put it into our working frameworks, investigations, and all of a sudden we're starting to build a working memory of it, where it's starting to become embedded into our learning. And ultimately, through several investigations, we then start to return it to the real world. We plop it into our long-term memory, where we start to evaluate We start to throw it to other applications. We start to then test it in the broader environment, and it becomes slowly but surely embedded within our longer term frameworks. So incoming information is constantly being processed. And the brain is asking these three things. Have I heard or seen this information before? Is it an existing schema or is it a new one? Where does it fit in? If it's existing, if it's new, what can I do with it? And can I assume that this is the same idea that I had yesterday or last month? Okay? And once we've done that, if we can do that, we are engaging our learners. And the active classrooms give better opportunities for information to be much better processed using the knowledge that we have of the brain and how the brain works. Barriers to engagement. What happens when we're running out of steam or esteem? And this happens a lot to science. Let's face it. Some teachers still have a reaction to science as a discipline area as part of an integrated curriculum. It gets 30 to 60 minutes per week, and sometimes, for instance, if science falls on sports day, then guess what? It gets 30 to 60 minutes a fortnight. It's often not being taught with relevance. We've heard Dennis Goodrum talk about that a lot this term, particularly in the science by doing frameworks. There's not enough experiments or hands-on stuff. How often have we seen teachers on prac where the teacher's doing the science experiment and all the kids are watching? You know, find a different experiment. There's too much content. Still, despite the fact that the ACS came in 2012, less than 40% of schools are actually actively engaged in full inquiry-based science teaching. So there's a lot of content-based material still being driven to learners in our schooling system. Students, some teachers and parents may think it's too hard. I've never been into science. I don't get science. I don't like science. And of course, some people think there's too much writing involved with science. Okay? It could be a Generation Y thing, who knows? Stahl, 2006, page 228, says learning takes place. Good learning, effective learning, embedded learning, long-term learning takes place in communities and is facilitated by artefacts which in turn sustain the communities that generate them. If it's important to me, I know what it means. If I put a piece of string around my middle finger, I know it's there to remind me that I've got to turn my alarm clock on for tomorrow morning. It's an artefact, the same that a robot's an artefact. Okay, it's there to signify a connection to a deeper purpose. Does teaching have good elements? Well, theoretically it does. And if we read Gregson this week, we can see that, you know, he talks about good teaching as being teaching for engagement, for learning, and for understanding. And basically assigns 4 steps to that. And these are generalizations. And, you know, assuming that this is like a lounge room, and like most lounge room, there's going to be some truth and some non-truth told here today. Gregson's text is a little bit like that. There's some generalizations in there. There's some truths and some half-truths and some non-truths. But basically, good teaching, we can say, it is about teaching for engagement and understanding. And how do we do that? We evaluate learning and respond through reflection. Okay, these are all motherhood concepts, so there should be nothing here to frighten you. You ask questions of yourself, the curriculum, and students. You develop your own understanding of concepts and teaching, and you identify and prepare resources, including safety awareness, particularly for science subjects. So these are the elements of good teaching. They're motherhood concepts. Okay, taken together, they're inoffensive. Taken together, they're difficult to measure. They're a continuum. They start with our current practices, and they take us through 20 years of teaching practice to when we're an experienced teacher, where we can then start to look at our levels of competence and our awareness of that competence. So they're a continuum. They're motherhood statements, and they're not actually ends in their own sense. But they're there to indicate what professional standards could look like, smell like, and feel like.